こんにちは、ムディターのリオです。今日はですね、アートと音楽が栄えるアメリカメリーランド州のバルチモーから皆さんにお届けします。9月26日、Musicafe という、南アメリカの音楽を中心に演奏をする、音楽会を、東京で開くことになりました。それに先立ちまして、今回プログラムの選曲に、協力をしていただいた、ブラジル出身の指揮者、ジュリアーノさんに、お越しいただいています。ということでですね、今日はそのブラジルの音楽を、そして今回プログラムで扱う3人のブラジル人の作曲家についてちょっとお話を伺っていきたいと思います。Thank you so much for being here today. Could you introduce yourself briefly?
I'm Juliano Aniceto. I'm a doctorate student at the Peabody Institute of the Johns Hopkins University. It's a pleasure to be here with my friend Rio and with each one of you. I'm a conductor from Brazil. I was born in São Paulo, lived for 20 years in Rio de Janeiro, and I have high interest in promoting diversity and to research different kinds of repertoire and include more colors, varieties, and nationalities in classical music.
Thank you so much. So I think first question that we would like to ask is that Brazil is quite far away from Europe, where all the classical music really started. How does those classical music influence come to Brazil, and how did it develop over the years?
Brazil was a country that was colonized by Portuguese, and since the very beginning of the process of colonization, we had this kind of like musical practice, the classical music as a musical practice brought to Brazil in different forms and styles. This process was really increased and really reiterated by the Napoleonic Wars that made with that the King of Portugal, Dom João VI, King John VI, moved with the whole court to Brazil, bringing scores, kapellmasters, and other different musicians. But actually, at that time, we already had in Brazil some really fine musicians, and we had a tradition on music, classical music in Brazil. And throughout the Romanticism and the search for the national identity, we start talking about the Brazil as a country and their own traditions as a theme for the classical compositions that we had, like especially in the second half of the 19th century and the 20th century.
Thank you so much. Now, can you give us some of the examples of Brazilian folk music?
Absolutely. We had in Brazil, of course, the music that was brought by the Portuguese, but also music that was, for example, discovered by Guerra Peixe. That's one of the composers that are in the program, that were brought to Brazil by gypsy people, by Western European immigrants. I would say like the most famous rhythm that is common knowledge is samba, but we also have maracatu. We also have baião that are like really from the northeast part of the country. We have the most recently we have the bossa nova that was born in the 60s. So there's a huge variety of rhythms and different kinds of where they are played is kind of there are different purposes. Some of them are for parties, some of them are like for some kind of celebrations in the middle of the year. So we have a huge variety in that matter.
That's very interesting. It's such a diverse background how Brazilian folk music developed. So, I'd like to move on to some of the composers from Brazil that we are performing on September 26th in Japan. Could you talk about those three composers particularly? What is some of the special thing about them, and why are they so important from Brazilian culture?
Yeah, so we have three composers that are so important for the construction of the sense of Brazil. I will start with Heitor Villa-Lobos. Heitor Villa-Lobos is definitely the biggest and most important Brazilian composer of all times. He's the only composer who got like a really stable projection in an international scenario. He lived throughout the 20th century. His works are concentrated in the 20th century, and Villa-Lobos is really responsible for the consolidation of the nationalistic identity. He worked in some way to connect Brazil with the native people of the country, sometimes bringing music that was inspired in the indigenous communities, and really thinking a Brazil that was in some way idealized, but also modern in the sense of style. It has a modernistic style to his music. César Guerra Peixe is a composer that's really important personally for me. He was professor of my professor in Brazil. He had a tradition where he taught in several places from Brazil, and actually his musical way started not as a classical musician. The first instrument he got contact with was the guitar, was the bandoline, and then he got to the violin, that was his main instrument. So deep inside we have this really intense traditional music that comes under a veil of classical music, of classical instruments, but you can feel the rhythm, the dance, the harmonies. Guerra Peixe worked on the northeast part of Brazil for 2 years, where he did like some ethnomusicological studies and researches, especially on the dance that I mentioned before, the maracatu. He has a variety of works, going from the 12-tone technique to the really more tonal world, but definitely his music is marked by the smell of Brazil, the sense of Brazil as a country that we have nowadays. Leopoldo Miguel was a completely different composer. He came historically before Heitor Villa-Lobos and before César Guerra Peixe. He was extremely important for the consolidation of music education in Brazil. He went to Europe to study. He was a big fan of Wagner, and when he came back, we had the proclamation of the Republic in Brazil, where the imperial times was over. Well, at that time, he was invited to be the director of the National Institute of Music, which became the UFRJ, the Federal University of the Rio de Janeiro, by the way, where I did my undergrad. Leopoldo Miguel also wrote a piece for a kind of a contest for the new national anthem of Brazil, but his piece actually was elected to be the independence hymn of Brazil. That's one of the official anthems of the country. So it's super important for me, and I feel really honored to have these three pieces, to see these three pieces played in Japan, because they are really the core of the composers that helped to structure the Brazilian culture that we see nowadays, that were developed through the end of 19th century and throughout the 20th century.
Well, thank you so much for this explanation in depth. This is really interesting, and those composers we have never heard of. We of course know Beethoven, Mozart, classical music fine in Japan, but these three composers, such an interesting background, and they're really diverse. So I'm really excited. Our musicians in Mudita are going to perform these pieces. So this is a little bit off topic, but what is your favorite Brazilian food?
My favorite Brazilian food, I'll definitely say that's the churrasco. That's like the barbecue.
Yeah.
It's so traditional in some way and so flavorful.
Yeah, well, thank you. Any dessert or sweets?
I would go with the traditional brigadeiro. I think if you are in Brazil, you need to try brigadeiro, and it's definitely a good treat for the soul.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we definitely have to try when we go to Brazil after COVID thing. But well, thank you. Finally, could you give us some of the message to the Japanese audiences who are going to be exploring Brazilian music in the future?
Absolutely. Brazil is the country who has more Japanese people outside of Japan. I think this is the biggest message that I would like to give to you all, is that not only in the country, not only in Brazil, but in every Brazilian heart, Japanese people always have a really nice place, and we have a massive amount of respect and love for you all. So don't miss the chance of giving us a visit, by tour, by going as a tourist to Brazil, or most of all, just consuming a little bit of the culture and getting to know. And if you, by the end of this concert, feel as happy as I am right now, I'm sure we will have gotten our mission accomplished. So you're always going to be in the hearts of all Brazilian people, and I wish you all the best.
Well, thank you so much, Juliano. This was a wonderful interview for us to have this information before the wonderful concert on September 26th. I wish you all the best, and hopefully we can see you all in Japan someday.
Absolutely, it's going to be my pleasure.